This video is brought to you together with Brilliant. Use the link in the description below for your special deal. A Boeing 737-800 is cruising over a dark and cloudy Europe. The pilots inside of the cockpit are looking down on their navigation display, confident that it shows them exactly where they are to within a few meters thanks to the Global Positioning System, the GPS. Suddenly, and without warning, the GPS system stops working. What kind of backup navigational systems do we have and how do they work? Today we'll be talking about the less known but equally awesome Inertial Reference System, the IRS, so stay tuned. Hi everybody and very welcome to Mentour. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic and welcome to a slightly more technical video, guys. And today we're going to be focusing on how an aircraft can navigate, all right? How it knows where it is at any given moment, even though you're flying over cloud, over mountains, or even over sea. So in most modern aircraft, like the 737-800 that I am flying, we are heavily reliant on the GPS, the Global Positioning System. But of course, the GPS position is not the only way that we have to navigate. And if the GPS would, for some reason, stop working, we normally have two GPS receivers in any given aircraft, so even if one gives up, we still have the other one. But if both of them would stop working, the aircraft would take one step back onto the second best navigational system that we have, which is the Inertial Reference System, the IRS. Now, the IRS system is far from only a navigational system. It actually gives data and information to a lot of different systems on board the aircraft, but we'll get to that in a second. Now, in order for you to understand how pilots navigate an aircraft, we need to go back to the very basics, okay? There are 5 different types of navigational systems that we use. Now, the first system is actually not a system. It's basically us, the pilot. It's called pilotage. And that is when we, the pilot, use maps and cues outside of the aircraft, like lakes, towns, mountains, rivers, and so on. And we navigate just like you would do when you're out navigating the streets using our eyes. Now, obviously, that way of navigating is not very effective if we get over a cloud layer, for example, or we're out of the sea. So while this was the initial way that pilots were navigating when aviation started up, it is something that we don't really use in commercial navigation. We fly on instruments instead. Now, that brings us to the next level of navigation, which is something called dead reckoning. So dead reckoning was the first way that pilots were using their instrumentations in order to navigate. The way that dead reckoning works is that you basically have a starting position, you have a heading, a track, and your speed, and a clock. So if you know your starting position, and then you start timing and you keep a constant speed on a constant track for a certain number of minutes, well then, if you've done your pre-planning correctly, you know that, okay, in order for me to go from this position to this church up here, it should take me 5 minutes with this speed. Once I reach that position, I'm going to turn right 30 degrees and I'm going to go on the new track for, say, 15 minutes. That should bring me to this lake. And then I will turn left, go on a northerly heading for 20 minutes at this speed, and it should bring me to my destination. So that's dead reckoning, all right? You're not using any kind of instrumentation to help you, but you're using your speed, the time, your track, so your magnetic compass. Now, if you do this right, it is actually remarkably accurate, okay? But if you're going to do this over a long distance, for each leg there's going to be some slight errors when it comes to your speed. Maybe your track keeping is not perfect, maybe you're a little bit late with starting your timing. So the error of your navigation is going to increase as the time builds on. Now, the third way of navigating is celestial navigation, right? Star navigation. And this was initially used for long-haul aircraft that was flying over oceans. So on the early Boeing 747s, for example, you can still find this star navigation window where the navigational officer would be up there using his sextant and a certain star and the angle it was over the horizon, the time of day. They could actually go into these tables and find out only based on a couple of different stars and a couple of different angles, almost exactly what their latitude and longitude was. Now, this is a very good way of navigating, but it's not very precise. It's not something you would want to use, for example, to do an approach. Okay, it takes a bit of time, but if you're sitting on a long-haul flight over an ocean, you have plenty of time. And if you do this on regular intervals, it means that you will have a fairly high certainty of where you are as you're crossing the ocean. The fourth way of navigating is something that we call radio navigation. And now we're getting into the way that modern airliners are navigating. So within radio navigation, you actually have GPS navigation as well, because the satellites are utilizing radio signals to send and receive messages from an aircraft. And depending on how long it takes for a radio signal to go and come back, you can get a very accurate reading of the distance. And if you have 5-6 different satellites at very predetermined positions, and they know exactly how far it is to reach you, well, then you can triangulate your position really, really well. So that's why the GPS system is so accurate. But that requires that you have enough satellites above the horizon in order to pinpoint your positions. And that might not always be the case. If you're flying in remote parts of the world, in mountainous terrain, for example, you might not actually have that. Okay. Now, in radio navigation, we also have things like ground-based radio navigation aids, basically radio beacons. And those beacons are still being used today, even though they are disappearing more and more. They will send out radio signals to the aircraft, and the aircraft instruments will interpret those signals either as a bearing, as in an arrow, a pointer that's pointing towards the beacon, or in the case of a VOR, it can actually give you a specific bearing so that you can fly in on a specific bearing and fly out from the navigational aid on a different bearing. And this is very, very useful when you're doing en route navigation. And if you see the way that airways are built over Europe, you can still see that they tend to go in between these VOR nav aids, because it's a way, it's a backup, it's a way to continue to fly and know where you are in case you would lose all other navigation. And ILS systems, instrument landing systems, the systems that we use to guide the aircraft down to land at the runway, they're also part of radio navigation. So radio navigation is something that we use every day, okay? And it is both a backup and a primary way of navigating. Now, this brings us to the fifth system, which is inertial navigation. Inertial navigation, that encompasses systems like the Inertial Navigation System, the INS, which is what it was called before, and the more modern variant of it, which is called Inertial Reference System, IRS, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the name Inertial Reference System kind of indicates the way that the system works. It works by measuring the inertia of the aircraft. It's a completely in-house system, which means that the Inertial Reference System or the Inertial Navigation System was housed inside of the aircraft and did not need any external input in order to work. In the early versions, the INS system consisted of 3 different gyroscopes that were mounted perpendicular to each other in order to measure movement around all 3 different axes, both pitch, roll, and yaw. And an easy way to kind of explain how this system works is that it needs its initial position, right? You need to input your initial position, where you are. And once that initial position has been fixed in the system, it kind of measures where it is depending on where you are not, right? It knows that when you start to move, when an acceleration and a movement is felt in one direction, it can measure the amount of acceleration, hence the amount of speed, and also the time that it takes before the next acceleration comes. And that way, it will know all the time how it's moving in relation to its original position. To make this a little bit easier to understand, picture that you have a paper, you know, one of those checkered papers? Well, providing that you know where to start on that paper. If I then give you instructions to go, for example, 3 boxes up, 5 boxes to the right, 6 boxes down, and another 3 boxes to the right, and 2 boxes down again. Well, since you can just follow these boxes, you will know where you end up. And the inertial reference system works exactly like that, but in all 3 dimensions. So in the very early versions of this inertial navigation system that came about in 1960s and 70s, they used conventional gyros. But these conventional gyros both have a tendency to break down on regular intervals, and there are also some internal friction inside of the gyros. And whenever you have that, it means that they're prone to start making errors over time. So as the systems developed and evolved, the engineers started looking into ways of perfecting the system and making it less prone to errors. And they started looking into something called laser ring gyros. Now, laser ring gyros is really, really fascinating. The way that those gyros works is that you have a ring, which is normally not actually a ring, it's either a triangle or a rectangle of mirrors. And then you have 2 lasers that are shot in opposite directions. And then you have a receiver that measures the time it takes for the light to travel around the ring. Now, if this ring stands completely still, the time it takes for both of these lasers to reach the receptor is the same. However, if this ring moves during the time it takes for the laser to leave its source and go to the receptor, well then, depending on how it moves, one of these lasers are going to move in a slightly longer distance than the other. Now obviously that difference is really, really tiny, but it's enough for the receiver to notice a slight difference in phase between these lasers, which create a kind of interference pattern that can be traced. Okay? And this interference pattern, it will differ depending on the amount of movement. So these laser gyros is extremely exact in showing difference in movement. And the benefit of these laser gyros is that there are no moving parts in them. Okay, so if you put these laser gyros into an IRS system, which is what we're using right now, they will be extremely accurate. The only kind of drift or error that you'll get out of a laser gyro is because of tiny imperfections in the mirrors or in the coating of the mirrors. Okay, but it's very, very small and they're very, very good. If you're using ring laser gyros, you also need accelerometers. So in order to make up an IRU, an inertial reference unit, of which we have 2 in the 737, you need 3 laser gyros and 3 accelerometers. And once again, they need to be set up in a way where they're perpendicular to each other so that they can show movement in all 3 planes. If you're a flight simmer out there, and you have been working on setting up the Boeing 737 for departure, you've noticed that as you go over the aft overhead panel in the cockpit and you switch the IRS unit to align, you will get a timing there. All right? Generally, it takes between 6 and 10 minutes for the IRSs to align. And during that time, as you continue with your pre-flight, you are going to have to put your initial position into the FMC CDU. Now, when you do that, that will feed your position into the IRS units. And like we were talking about before, the IRSs needs to know your original position in order to start figuring out everything else that it's doing. During that time, if you have a look at your primary flight display and your navigation display, you will see that they're just full of flags. And the reason for that is because the IRSs are so much more than a navigational system. It's also feeding your pitch, roll, yaw, magnetic heading, true heading, wind, drift angle, ground speed, true airspeed, vertical speed, and a few other systems. So the IRS system is one of the more critical systems that we have on board. So why does it take so long for it then to align? Well, here is where it becomes really, really fascinating, because these laser gyros and accelerometers, they are incredible. Okay? They can sense even the smallest movement and acceleration. This, by the way, is why we have to align them before passengers start boarding the aircraft, because the fact of passengers moving around in the cabin can actually cause accelerations of the aircraft, movements of the aircraft enough to disturb the alignment process. So we tend to align the IRSs the first thing we do, way before we board passengers. And it can be a real problem if it's windy outside. Because it is windy outside. This has actually happened to me. The wind might move the aircraft enough for the IRSs not to be able to align. So the IRSs, they're sitting there and you power them up. And when you do, they will remember the last position they were in. In most cases, that's exactly the same position as you are in, because an aircraft that comes in at night and parks and powers off is probably going to be there in the morning. But it's not always true. Sometimes the aircraft has been moved to a different parking locations or even, to a hangar overnight. So you have to put in the accurate new position. But as you are powering up the IRSs now, the IRSs will start to feel all of the accelerations that is working on it as you're standing still on the ground. You might ask yourself, what do you mean accelerations when you're standing completely still? Well, the first thing it will feel is gravity. Okay, that's an acceleration. And when it feels gravity, it means that it can start to align itself in pitch and roll. All right, it knows that, okay, the gravity is straight down. It will always point towards the core of the Earth. So I must be in this kind of level. Okay, that makes sense if you think about it. The next acceleration it will feel is the rotation of the Earth. So it will feel that, I am moving forward with a speed of about 15 degrees per hour normally. And depending on the speed it is feeling, so that acceleration and the speed it notices, it will also start figuring out where it is on the Earth, because the speed will be different if you are down by the equator, where the speed is greater, or if you're close to the pole, where the speed is much, much slower. So now, knowing the acceleration down towards the center of the Earth and knowing the speed is going forward, it can calculate, all right, I am probably at this latitude. This is quicker when the speed is higher, so the closer you are to the equator, the quicker it will align. But also it needs to know where it is longitude-wise, because it can only figure out, right, the speed should put me on this latitude. I don't really know where I am longitude-wise. So that's why we have to put in the current position. And now, since it knows its latitude and longitude and pitch, it will also start feeling, okay, so if I'm at this latitude, I should have this speed. However, I am feeling a slight difference in angle here, right? The speed is not straightforward, a little bit to an angle, right? So that must mean that the true north is that way. So it's starting to calculate the direction of true north as well. And all of these different components, both the pitch, its latitude, longitude, and true north, they are depending on each other. Okay, so they become more and more accurate the longer the IRSs get to align themselves. And this is why it takes 6 to 10 minutes when you start it up, in order for the IRSs to have kind of figured out all of these different angles and all of these different accelerations and movement and make sense of them. So once the IRSs are done calculating all of this, well then, if you look down on your primary flight display, it will just light up, all of the flags will disappear, you'll get all of the data needed, and you can start operating using the IRSs. So as I kind of alluded to before, the IRS system is not working by itself. In fact, in a modern aircraft, all of the other inputs that the aircraft is providing, like for example the dynamic pressure from the pitot tubes, the static pressure, the temperature, even the GPS position, this is all fed into a unit called the Air Data Inertial Reference Unit, and then the computer is kind of interpreting all of this data and giving the absolute most accurate information back to the pilots through the primary flight display and the navigational display. So this is a fantastic system. Does it have any weaknesses then? Yeah, of course it does. This is where it becomes a little bit complicated and also a little bit disappointing if you're a flat earther, because a lot of the problems that the IRSs have is due to the fact that the Earth is a spheroid, right? That it's almost round. Because the way that gyros work is, once a gyro is set, it's actually not pointing in relation to the Earth. It's pointing to a point in space straight ahead. Okay, so when we take off, we start flying the aircraft, Obviously, as we're covering distance, we are following the surface of the Earth. That's what we don't want to fly out in space, we want to fly over the surface of the Earth. Now, in relation to an IRS, this means that there will be an angular difference. As we are traveling over the globe, we will actually be, according to the IRS, pitching down a little bit. Now, this is a tiny little drift, but as an aircraft is maybe covering a large portion of the Earth, it will become bigger and bigger as the aircraft starts flying. So the IRSs are set up to compensate for this because it also knows its position. It's fairly easy to compensate for this particular drift. But there are other drifts as well. Remember how we talked about the fact that the Earth was rotating and that the IRSs could feel that rotational speed? Well, as the aircraft gets airborne, the Earth will still be rotating under it, and this will cause errors as well when it comes to, for example, the speed. So once again, this is something that needs to be compensated for. And if you're traveling in a north-southerly direction, the Earth will rotate below you as well, and the way that you fly, even though it looks like a straight line over the Earth's surface, since the Earth is constantly rotating, it means that the aircraft is also kind of constantly turning. A very tiny little bit, but still it needs to do so, because if you're going from A to B on a rotating sphere, you are going to have to constantly kind of follow that rotation with the aircraft. And of course, a laser gyro, once again, is pointing on one particular point in space. And if you are moving away from that point of space, it will feel that as a slight turn. And this also needs to be compensated for. So there are all of these little drifts that needs to be taken into account in order for the IRS system to work properly. But since we are people of science, we know about all of these things, and modern IRS systems are incredibly accurate. And we know this because when we're out flying, you can actually switch over on the EFIS control panel to look at your nav settings. And in there, you will see the aircraft symbol. Okay, the aircraft symbol on the navigation display will be a little triangle, and the position of the aircraft is at the top of that triangle. And you can then see where the GPSs thinks that you are, and also where the IRSs thinks that you are. And you'll be amazed how close those are to each other. Like on this video, for example, you see that one of the IRSs, that's the little star symbol, is slightly up ahead and to the left of the aircraft, but the other IRS is bang on, together with the GPS symbols that are also bang on. Now, during normal day-to-day operation, the IRSs are actually using inputs from the GPS signals to kind of counteract some of the errors that we were talking about earlier. So this means that if the GPSs would shut down completely for one reason or another, then as the aircraft keeps flying, initially the IRSs will be very, very exact, but then over time these errors will start creeping in, and the accuracy of the navigation might not be as exact. And because of that, the IRSs are not to be used, for example, for RNAV approaches or for really exact GPS arrival routes. But what would happen in case we were out flying and for whatever reason there would be a power interruption to the IRSs, so they would lose alignment? Well, that wouldn't be great, because as we were talking about before, the IRSs are actually the basis for our attitude information, for example, and loads of other really important instrumentation as well. And because of that, you can actually do a partial realignment of the IRSs. So even though you will lose your position, so you wouldn't be able to use them for navigational purposes anymore, you can actually put them into attitude and align the attitude, and then get your primary flight, instrumentation back again. If that wouldn't be possible, then we always have the standby horizon that can be used, which is independent of the IRSs. As you can see, guys, as we started off this video with asking what would happen in case the GPSs would stop working and you were out flying somewhere of Europe. Well, the answer to that is that we would just kind of go back onto the next system, the next redundant system we have, which are the IRSs, and we would be easily continuing to fly towards our destination. Now, if the IRSs would then fail on us, then we would have a problem, right? A lot of our instrumentation would disappear, but we would have the standby horizon, and we would be able to continue to navigate using conventional navigation, as in these ground-based radio beacons, and we can use them to navigate. And after that, we can use air traffic control to give us radar vectors to find our way down towards a working instrument landing system and get the aircraft safely down on the ground. So there are loads and loads of layers of backups to help us get down safely. Doing research for an episode like this really gives me appreciation for the people who built these amazing, fantastical navigational systems. And it really makes you appreciate the importance of, for example, physics knowledge, to understand the world that's going on around you, and for mathematics, because without really good knowledge in mathematics, there's no way that they could have calibrated the systems down to these incredible levels. And that's why I am so happy to have Brilliant as a sponsor of this episode. Now, Brilliant is an absolutely fantastic online learning platform with hundreds of courses of things, for example, about fundamentals of mathematics, physics, but also these brain puzzles where you have to kind of apply your knowledge. And when you come across something that you don't really understand, they will have a really good explanation for how to understand it so that you can build on that and solve more and more complex problems. I have been working on Brilliant together with my son Lucas, who's 11 years old, and he really loves these brain puzzles, and he gets so happy every time that he manages to solve something. If this sounds interesting to you, I would love for you to go down into the video description of this video and click on the Brilliant link. It will give you a whopping 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, but it's completely free to open it up and check it out. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, which is a little bit more technical. I would love to hear from you guys what you want me to do more of. Do you want me to do more reaction videos, maybe more technical videos, or maybe more videos about incidents and accidents? Let me know in the comment section here in the video, or go into my Discord server. Right? There's a link in the video description below where you can just go in. It's completely free to go both to my Discord server and to the Mentour Aviation app as well. Both of these forums are available. You can just tag me and I'll try to answer it. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.